On a normal Sunday morning, John Rodgers Airport did not look like the front line of anything. It was a strip of coral and asphalt just outside Honolulu, a civilian field squeezed between sugarcane, houses, and the gleaming water of Ke'ehai Lagoon. The big drama here was usually whether the trade winds would pick up before the last student pilot could squeeze in a few landings. On December 7th, 1941, the first light came in soft and pink over the Koolau Range. In one hangar, mechanics were rolling small yellow and orange trainers out onto the ramp. In another, instructors were pouring coffee, checking logbooks and teasing their students about weekend dates and botched landings. A Hawaiian Airlines DC-3 sat near the terminal, being readied for its regular inter-island hop. A few sleepy passengers were already arriving with suitcases. John Rodgers was home to 3 tiny flying schools: KT Flying Service, Andrew Flying Service, and Gambo Flying Service. They owned an assortment of little airplanes, Piper Cubs, Aeroncas, and interstate cadet nothing that looked remotely like a weapon. Most of their business came from one government program with a long, boring name, the Civilian Pilot Training Program. 2 years earlier, hardly anyone outside aviation circles had heard of it. In 1938-39, worried that the United States had too few pilots, Washington had quietly started paying colleges and private schools to teach young Americans to fly. The official aim was vocational training and a boost for the struggling aviation industry. The unofficial aim was obvious. If war came, those civilians could be turned into military pilots in a hurry. By 1941, more than 1,000 colleges and over 1,000 flight schools were part of the program, and hundreds of thousands of students had passed through its courses. On Oahu, the University of Hawaii ran the classroom side. The practical flying happened here, at John Rodgers. Some students were college kids. Others were defence workers from the shipyards, sailors and soldiers who spent their off-duty hours trading their pay for flying hours, hoping that wings might one day take them off the ground for good. Their training aircraft was simple: 40-60 horsepower engines, fabric-covered wings, cruising speeds around 80-100 miles an hour. Perfect for touch-and-go landings and lazy sightseeing, useless for war. At about 7:15 that morning, 3 National Guardsmen stepped off a bus near the field. They belonged to Battery F of the 251st Coast Artillery Regiment, California National Guard, temporarily stationed in Hawaii. 2 of them, Sergeant Henry Blackwell and Corporal Clyde Brown, had earned their private licenses here through the Civilian Pilot Training Program. Today was a kind of farewell one-last joy ride with a friend before their unit shipped out. They walked through the gate toward the KT hangar where 2 bright yellow Piper Cubs waited. The Cubs were tiny tandem trainers, barely 7 meters long, with wings you could almost touch standing next to them. Each one carried 2 people and a little fuel, no armour, no radios powerful enough to talk very far. They were the aviation equivalent of bicycles. Inside the hangar, the co-owner of KT Flying Service, 38-year-old Bob Tice, was finishing paperwork. He had built his little company on sightseeing flights and lessons long before the government money arrived, and he had thrown himself into the new program as soon as it reached Hawaii. He and his instructors had put dozens of workers and servicemen through the course. Brown and Blackwell were among his favourite students. His wife, Edna, was coming down to see them off. They were due to leave Hawaii the next day. Across the field, in the neighbouring Andrew Flying Service hangar, a very different instructor was checking her own aircraft, 22-year-old Cornelia Fort from Nashville, Tennessee. She'd grown up in a mansion with servants and debutante balls, but somewhere along the way she had fallen in love with flying instead of country clubs. She had become one of the first women in her home state to hold a commercial pilot's license and an instructor rating. When the civilian pilot training program expanded to Hawaii, she had taken a job in Honolulu, teaching soldiers, sailors, and defence workers how to fly. Her regular Sunday student, a defence worker named Ernest Swummerler, arrived just before sunrise. He was almost ready to solo. Today's lesson was supposed to be his last session of supervised takeoffs and landings before that big moment. Their steed was an Interstate S1A Cadet, a two-seat high-wing trainer with about 65 horsepower and a fabric-covered frame. Fully loaded, it weighed barely half a ton. Compared to the big army fighters parked at Wheeler Field, it was a toy. A little after 7:30, Cornelia and Swomela took off from John Rodgers and began a pattern of touch-and-go landings, climbing to a few hundred feet, circling and coming back down over and over. The weather was mild, the sky partly cloudy. From the cockpit you could see the outline of the harbour, the battleships at anchor, the neat lines of hangars at Hickam Field. It looked peaceful. By 7:40, the field was busy. The two Piper Cubs from KT took off, one after another, gathering speed along the 1,000-foot coral strip and lifting eastward over the water. One carried Brown and a fellow soldier. The other carried Blackwell and Sergeant Warren Rasmussen. They climbed gently to 500 or 800 feet and turned west, paralleling Waikiki Beach, then out over the sea toward their base on the far side of the island. North of Oahu, several hundred miles away, another group of pilots had been airborne for hours. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers had launched 353 aircraft in 2 waves: fighters, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and horizontal bombers. They approached Oahu from the north, low over the water, using heavy clouds to mask their presence. At 7:40, the first wave began to spread out across the island. At 7:49, their commander gave the final order to attack. A few minutes later, the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. But for the civilian pilots, the first sign of war was not an explosion. It was the sudden appearance of unfamiliar aircraft. Up on the northern coast near Laie, another instructor from the John Rodgers community, Guy Tommy Tomberlin, was in the air with a student in a bright Aeronca 65TC rented from Gambo Flying Service. They were flying along the shoreline at about 1,000 feet, when Tomberlin noticed 2 streams of red tracer fire streaking toward them from behind. The bullets tore fist-sized holes in the fabric of the tail and rear fuselage. Instinct took over. He snapped the Aeronca into a descending turn, jinking left and right as additional bursts of tracers laced the air where they had just been. For several minutes, 2 Japanese fighters chased the tiny orange airplane, firing in bursts trying to swat it out of the sky. The Aeronca had no armour, no weapons, and no radio powerful enough to call for help. Somehow, perhaps because the Japanese pilots had bigger targets waiting at Kaneohe Naval Air Station and other bases, they broke off. Tomberlin hugged the waves and headed back toward Honolulu, hoping the pally pass through the mountains would conceal them. Farther south, another Gambo rental, the Aeronca tandem flown by Honolulu attorney Roy Vitusek, and his 16-year-old son Martin was returning from a sightseeing trip. They were circling near John Rodgers at about 800 feet, lining up to land, when Martin spotted several fast, low-flying aircraft and shouted, "Look, P-40s!" His father glanced over, expecting to see American fighters, and instead saw the red sun emblem of Japan painted on the wings. In that moment, the entire view out of their cockpit changed. Smoke was rising from the direction of Pearl Harbor. More aircraft were diving and climbing around Hickam Field to the northwest. Vitusek pushed the Aeronca into a steep turn away from the chaos. Rear gunners in some of the Japanese bombers fired at them as they passed, but the little civilian plane somehow escaped and eventually slipped back into John Rodgers, where father and son abandoned the aircraft and ran for cover. By now it was clear that this was not an exercise, not a movie shoot, not some kind of accident. For the people on the ramp at John Rodgers, the attack announced itself with a different kind of sound. The staccato ripping of machine gun fire and the heavy thump of bombs falling on Hickam Field barely a mile away. Back at the KT hangar, Bob and Edna Tice arrived at the field around 7:50. They noticed smoke boiling up over the horizon toward Pearl Harbor and could hear distant concussions. Bob stepped out into the sun and called to Edna, telling her he thought something had exploded at Hickam, maybe an ammunition dump. As they watched, a low-flying twin-seat aircraft came roaring in from that direction, surprisingly close to the ground for a military plane over a civilian airport. Edna glanced at her watch. It read 7:55. The aircraft streaked over the field, so low that she could see the crew clearly, then curved out over the lagoon, banked hard, and came back. As it lined up with the row of hangars, its gunner opened fire. Bullets kicked up dust and sparks as they walked across the ramp. One of the rounds struck Bob in the back of the head, killing him instantly. Edna, standing right beside him and untouched, dropped to her knees to check his pulse, though she already knew there was nothing to be done. At that same moment, Cornelia Fort was turning her interstate cadet back toward the field for another landing. They were at about 200 feet in the traffic pattern southeast of the airport. She glanced left to check the airspace before asking her student to turn base leg and saw a single silver aircraft approaching from the sea. At first she assumed it was an Army pursuit plane, one of the P-40s often seen around Oahu. It seemed it would pass safely beneath them. Then, in her peripheral vision, she caught a different airplane directly in their path, closing fast on a collision course. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the controls, shoved the throttle forward, and hauled back on the stick. The little cadet leapt upward just as the oncoming fighter flashed underneath. She felt the vibration of its engine through the airframe. As it passed, she looked down to read the tail number and instead saw red circles painted on the wings. Looking toward Pearl Harbor, she saw a column of black smoke and tiny specks spiraling down bombs in free fall. For a few seconds, her brain refused to process it. Then training and instinct took over again. The sky, she realized, was the worst possible place for a fabric-covered trainer in the middle of an air raid. She pushed the nose down and headed straight for John Rodgers, staying low, hoping to get on the ground before anyone else decided to shoot at them. As she taxied in after landing, another Japanese aircraft crossed the field at low altitude, guns blazing. Bullets stitched the runway in front of her. She swung the cadet toward the Andrew Flying Service hangar and rolled to a stop. She and Swamala jumped out and sprinted inside as more rounds struck the ground behind them. When Cornelia burst into the office and shouted, "The Japs are attacking!" some of the people inside laughed, thinking it was a joke. The laughter stopped when a mechanic ran in and announced that Bob Tice had just been killed on the ramp. Out over the water, the two bright yellow Piper Cubs flown by Brown, Blackwell and Rasmussen were in terrible trouble. They were somewhere just off the entrance to Pearl Harbor, about 500 feet above the sea, when several Japanese aircraft spotted them. A crew on a harbor tugboat later recalled seeing the Cubs cruising peacefully when as many as 7 Japanese planes swooped down. The little trainers never stood a chance. They had no radios to warn anyone, no armor, no guns, and nowhere to hide. Witnesses saw one Cub hit and plummet straight into the ocean, while the other circled briefly, trailing smoke or struggling in the turbulence, before also crashing into the water. Rescue boats sent out from the harbour found only floating debris, bright yellow fabric and fragments of wing. The 3 National Guardsmen became some of the very first American servicemen killed by enemy fire that day. Back at John Rodgers, Japanese aircraft continued to pass overhead as they attacked Hickam Field and other targets. One bomber strafed the Hawaiian Airlines DC-3 that had been preparing for its morning flight to Maui, riddling the airliner with bullet holes. Luckily, ground staff had hustled the passengers off when they realized something was terribly wrong. No one on the DC-3 was killed. For the civilian pilots and instructors, the field itself became a deadly trap. They had nowhere to run. There were no air raid shelters, no anti-aircraft guns, no way to fight back. Their hangars and light aircraft were incidental targets in a larger plan aimed at battleships and major air bases. But being an incidental target is cold comfort when 7.7mm rounds are ripping across concrete in front of you. If you pause for a moment and imagine the scene from the ground, remember that almost nobody here had any warning. There were no sirens before the first strafing run, no announcement on the radio, no prior air raid drills for civilians. One minute you are teaching a student how to flare properly on landing, or handing a boarding pass to a passenger, or unloading crates of soda for the airport cafe. The next, there is black smoke rising over Pearl Harbor, explosions thumping in your chest, and fast, unfamiliar aircraft crossing the field low, spraying bullets at anything that moves. In the skies above, the main attack unfolded with brutal efficiency. The first wave of Japanese planes had begun bombing and torpedoing the ships at Pearl Harbor at about 7:55 a.m. Battleships along Battleship Row were struck by armour-piercing bombs and torpedoes. The USS Arizona would explode catastrophically just after 8:10. Other aircraft hammered Hickam, Wheeler and other Army airfields, destroying or disabling scores of American airplanes on the ground. A second wave of attackers arrived around 8:54, continuing the assault. By the end of the morning, more than 2,400 Americans were dead, and over 180 aircraft had been destroyed. In that awful tally, the losses from John Rodgers were numerically small but symbolically huge. The first American aircraft shot down in the Pacific War was not a fighter or bomber, but a civilian Piper J-3 Cub, flown by a machinist's mate who had learned to fly through a civilian program and happened to be in the air at the wrong moment. Other Cubs, Aronkas, and the little interstate cadet had been chased, riddled with holes or destroyed outright. Their pilots and students were some of the first people on Oahu to realize what was happening, but they had no way to warn anyone in time. By late morning, the attack was over. Japanese aircraft turned back toward their carriers, leaving behind burning ships, shattered hangars, and a stunned island. At John Rodgers, the survivors emerged from their improvised hiding places, the bushes along the runway, offices, cars, wherever they had crouched when the shooting began. They moved carefully among the debris, checking for wounded, trying to make sense of a field that just hours before had been an ordinary Sunday workplace. For the families of those who didn't come back, the Tice, the relatives of Brown, Blackwell and Rasmussen, the day's devastation was intensely personal. Yet their stories quickly became footnotes. The headlines and official histories focused, understandably, on battleships, admirals, and the broader geopolitical shock. Civilian flight instructors and student pilots did not fit the usual image of Pearl Harbor heroes. Still, the consequences for their small world were profound. Within hours of the attack, all civilian flying in Hawaii was grounded. The civilian pilot training program aircraft on the islands were seized or tightly controlled. Airspace that had been a playground for hobbyists and students became militarized overnight. Some of the surviving instructors and students on the mainland would be swept into the newly renamed War Training Service, and then into the Army Air Forces and Navy Aviation. Others, like Cornelia Fort, would join the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Service, ferrying military aircraft within the United States and freeing male pilots for combat. Cornelia herself returned to the mainland in the early 1942, made a brief appearance in a war bond film, and then answered a telegram inviting her to join the women's ferrying program. She went on to fly a variety of military aircraft as a civilian pilot in uniform basic trainers, advanced trainers, sometimes under difficult conditions, navigating by maps and landmarks with often unreliable radios. In March 1943, she was killed in a mid-air collision while ferrying a trainer in Texas, becoming the first American woman to die while serving as a military pilot. The civilian pilot training program also changed irrevocably. After the attack, it was reorganized as the War Training Service with a more explicitly military purpose. Students still trained at civilian schools and colleges, but now they signed contracts agreeing to enter the armed forces after graduation. By the time the program wound down in 1944, it had trained more than 400,000 pilots, a huge pool of aviators who helped fill the cockpits of fighters, bombers, transports and liaison aircraft in every theatre of the war. When you look back at that transformation, John Rodgers Airport on the morning of December 7th becomes something more than just a tragic incident. It becomes a snapshot of a country balanced on the edge between peace and total war. On one side of that line, you have Edna and Bob Tice driving to work at a little flying school, thinking about goodbyes and lesson schedules. You have college students and guardsmen using government money to chase a dream of flight. You have a young woman from Tennessee happily teaching takeoffs and landings to a defense worker, planning to sign him off for his solo flight. You have an attorney taking his teenage son on his sightseeing trip in a rented Aeronca. On the other side of that line, just minutes later, you have bullet-riddled trainers falling into the sea. You have a civilian instructor killed by a machine gun burst on his own ramp. You have a flight logbook where the day's entry, which should have read Students' Final Supervised Landings, instead says, Flight interrupted by Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Enemy airplane shot at my plane and missed. The flight schools at John Rodgers never set out to go to war. They existed to sell lessons, build careers, maybe give their students an edge when applying to the Army or Navy. Yet for a brief, violent hour, they found themselves right in the path of one of the most significant military operations in modern history. Their story shows how quickly the abstract idea of war can slam into the lives of people who thought they were far from the front. It shows how civilian students, hobbyists, small business owners can become combatants or casualties in a matter of seconds, not because they chose to fight, but because war does not respect the boundaries between military and civilian once it begins. And it underlines a quieter point too. When the United States began that seemingly mundane program to train civilian pilots, many critics in Congress had called it a waste of money, a boondoggle, even a dangerous step toward militarism. But in the first minutes of the Pacific War, it was those unnecessary pilots who were already in the sky, who first saw the enemy up close, who survived or died in the first chaotic moments. In the years that followed, veterans of the program would fill cockpits across the world, providing a depth of experience that the US military alone could never have created so quickly. If you stand today on the grounds of what used to be John Rodgers Airport, now part of Honolulu's International Airfield Complex, it is hard to picture the small cluster of hangars, the bright yellow Cubs, the orange Aeroncas, the tiny interstate cadet rolling down a coral runway. Jetliners come and go, carrying tourists and business travellers who rarely think about the morning when this place was strafed by low-flying bombers. But if you know where to look, you can still find traces in museum exhibits about the lost aviators of Pearl Harbor, in faded logbooks with a single extraordinary line, in the medals and memory records of the National Guard, and in the stories handed down by families. The flight school that accidentally went to war did not win a battle or sink an enemy ship. What it did was reveal, in miniature, the human cost of a surprise attack and the thin line between ordinary life and history. The student pilots who took off that morning thought they were chasing horizons, practicing cross-country navigation, building hours for a license. Instead, they became part of the first chapter of America's war in the Pacific,